The analytic-synthetic distinction is a conceptual distinction, used primarily in philosophy to distinguish propositions into two types: analytic propositions and synthetic propositions. Analytic propositions are true by virtue of their meaning, while synthetic propositions are true by how their meaning relates to the world. However, philosophers have used the terms in very different ways. Furthermore, philosophers have debated whether there is a legitimate distinction. Kant. Conceptual containment. The philosopher Immanuel Kant uses the terms analytic and synthetic to divide propositions into two types. Kant introduces the analytic-synthetic distinction in the introduction to his Critique of Pure Reason. There, he restricts his attention to statements that are affirmative subject-predicate judgments, and defines analytic proposition and synthetic proposition as follows. Analytic proposition: a proposition whose predicate concept is contained in its subject concept. Synthetic proposition: a proposition whose predicate concept is not contained in its subject concept but related. Examples of analytic propositions, on Kant's definition, include: all bachelors are unmarried. All triangles have three sides. Kant's own example is: all bodies are extended, that is, occupy space. The concept bachelor contains the concept unmarried. The concept unmarried is part of the definition of the concept bachelor. Likewise, for triangle and has three sides, and so on. Examples of synthetic propositions, on Kant's definition, include: all bachelors are unhappy. All creatures with hearts have kidneys. Kant's own example is: all bodies are heavy. As with the previous examples classified as analytic propositions, each of these new statements is an affirmative subject-predicate judgment. However, in none of these cases does the subject concept contain a predicate concept. The concept bachelor does not contain a concept unhappy. Unhappy is not a part of the definition of bachelor. The same is true for creatures with hearts and have kidneys, even if every creature with a heart also has kidneys. The concept creature with a heart does not contain a concept has kidneys. Kant's version and the a priori, a posteriori distinction in the introduction to the Critique of Pure Reason. Kant contrasts his distinction between analytic and synthetic propositions with another distinction: the distinction between a priori and a posteriori propositions. He defines these terms as follows: a priori proposition: a proposition whose justification does not rely upon experience. Moreover, the proposition can be validated by experience, but is not grounded in experience. Therefore, it is logically necessary. A posteriori proposition: a proposition whose justification does rely upon experience. The proposition is validated by, and grounded in, experience. Therefore, it is logically contingent. Examples of a priori propositions include: all bachelors are unmarried. 7 plus 5 equals 12. The justification of these propositions does not depend upon experience. One need not consult experience to determine whether all bachelors are unmarried, nor whether 7 plus 5 equals 12. Examples of a posteriori propositions include: all bachelors are unhappy. Tables exist. Both of these propositions are a posteriori. Any justification of them would require one's experience. The analytic, synthetic distinction and the a priori, a posteriori distinction together yield four types of propositions: analytic a priori, synthetic a priori, analytic a posteriori, synthetic a posteriori. Kant says the third type is self-contradictory, so he discusses only the remaining three types as components of his epistemological framework. The ease of knowing analytic propositions. Part of Kant's argument in the introduction to the Critique of Pure Reason involves arguing that there is no problem figuring out how knowledge of analytic propositions is possible. To know an analytic proposition, Kant argued, one need not consult experience. Instead, one need merely to take the subject and extract from it, in accordance with the principle of contradiction, the required predicate. In analytic propositions, the predicate concept is contained in the subject concept. Thus, to know an analytic proposition is true, one need merely examine the concept of the subject. If one finds the predicate contained in the subject, the judgment is true. Thus, for example, one need not consult experience to determine whether all bachelors are unmarried is true. One need merely examine the subject concept and see if the predicate concept, unmarried, is contained in it. And in fact, it is. Unmarried is part of the definition of bachelor, and so is contained within it. Thus the proposition, all bachelors are unmarried, can be known to be true without consulting experience. It follows from this, Kant argued, first, all analytic propositions are a priori. There are no a posteriori analytic propositions. It follows, second, there is no problem understanding how we can know analytic propositions. We can know them because we just need to consult our concepts in order to determine that they are true. The possibility of metaphysics after ruling out the possibility of analytic a posteriori propositions, and explaining how we can obtain knowledge of analytic a priori propositions. Kant also explains how we can obtain knowledge of synthetic a posteriori propositions. That leaves only the question of how knowledge of synthetic a priori propositions is possible. This question is exceedingly important, Kant maintains, because all important metaphysical knowledge is of synthetic a priori propositions. If it is impossible to determine which synthetic a priori propositions are true, he argues, then metaphysics as a discipline is impossible. The remainder of the Critique of Pure Reason is devoted to examining whether and how knowledge of synthetic a priori propositions is possible. Logical positivists Frege and Kant revised the Kantian definition over 100 years later. A group of philosophers took interest in Kant and his distinction between analytic and synthetic propositions. The logical positivists, part of Kant's examination of the possibility of synthetic a priori knowledge, involved the examination of mathematical propositions, such as 7 plus 5 equals 12. The shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. Kant maintained that mathematical propositions such as these are synthetic a priori propositions, and that we know them. That they are synthetic, he thought, is obvious. The concept equal to 12 is not contained within the concept 7 plus 5, and the concept straight line is not contained within the concept the shortest distance between 2 points. From this, Kant concluded that we have knowledge of synthetic a priori propositions. He went on to maintain that it is extremely important to determine how such knowledge is possible. Gottlob Frege's notion of analyticity included a number of logical properties and relations beyond containment, symmetry, transitivity, antinomy, or negation, and so on. He had a strong emphasis on formality, in particular formal definition, and also emphasized the idea of substitution of synonymous terms. All bachelors are unmarried can be expanded out with the formal definition of bachelor as unmarried man to form all unmarried men are unmarried, which is recognizable as tautologous and therefore analytic from its logical form. Any statement of the form all etc. f. This expanded idea of analyticity was able to show that all Kant's examples of arithmetical and geometrical truths are analytical a priori truths and not synthetic a priori truths. Thanks to Frege's logical semantics, particularly his concept of analyticity, arithmetic truths like 7 plus 5 equals 12 are no longer synthetic a priori but analytical a priori truths in Carnap's extended sense of analytic. Hence logical empiricists are not subject to Kant's criticism of Hume for throwing out mathematics along with metaphysics. The origin of the logical positivists' distinction. The logical positivists agreed with Kant that we have knowledge of mathematical truths. and further that mathematical propositions are a priori. However, they did not believe that any complex metaphysics, such as the type Kant supplied, are necessary to explain our knowledge of mathematical truths. Instead, the logical positivists maintained that our knowledge of judgments like all bachelors are unmarried, and our knowledge of mathematics are in the basic sense the same. All proceeded from our knowledge of the meanings of terms or the conventions of language. Since empiricism had always asserted that all knowledge is based on experience, this assertion had to include knowledge in mathematics. On the other hand, we believe that with respect to this problem the rationalists had been right in rejecting the old empiricist view that the truth of 2 + 2 = 4 is contingent on the observation of facts, a view that would lead to the unacceptable consequence that an arithmetical statement might possibly be refuted tomorrow by new experiences. Our solution, based upon Wittgenstein's conception, consisted in asserting the thesis of empiricism only for factual truth. By contrast, the truths of logic and mathematics are not in need of confirmation by observations. Because they do not state anything about the world of facts, they hold for any possible combination of facts. Rudolf Carnap, Autobiography. 10. Semantics. 64. Logical positivist definitions. Thus the logical positivists drew a new distinction, and, inheriting the terms from Kant, named it the analytic, synthetic distinction. They provided many different definitions, such as the following. Analytic proposition. A proposition whose truth depends solely on the meaning of its terms. Analytic proposition. A proposition that is true by definition. Analytic proposition. A proposition that is made true solely by the conventions of language. Synthetic propositions were then defined as synthetic proposition. A proposition that is not analytic. These definitions applied to all propositions, regardless of whether they were of subject-predicate form. Thus, under these definitions, the proposition, "it is raining" or "it is not raining," was classified as analytic, while under Kant's definitions it was neither analytic nor synthetic, and the proposition, 7 + 5 = 12, was classified as analytic, while under Kant's definitions it was synthetic. Two-dimensionalism. Two-dimensionalism is an approach to semantics in analytic philosophy. It is a theory of how to determine the sense and reference of a word and the truth value of a sentence. It is intended to resolve a puzzle that has plagued philosophy for some time, namely, how is it possible to discover empirically that a necessary truth is true? Two-dimensionalism provides an analysis of the semantics of words and sentences that makes sense of this possibility. The theory was first developed by Robert Stalnaker, but it has been advocated by numerous philosophers since, including David Chalmers and Berit Brogard. Any given sentence, for example, the words, "water is H2O," is taken to express two distinct propositions, often referred to as a primary intention and a secondary intention, which together compose its meaning. The primary intention of a word or sentence is its sense, i.e., is the idea or method by which we find its referent. The primary intention of water might be a description, such as watery stuff. The thing picked out by the primary intention of water could have been otherwise. For example, on some other world where the inhabitants take water to mean watery stuff, but where the chemical makeup of watery stuff is not H2O. It is not the case that water is H2O for that world. The secondary intention of water is whatever thing water happens to pick out in this world, whatever that world happens to be. So if we assign water the primary intention watery stuff, then the secondary intention of water is H2O, since H2O is watery stuff in this world. The secondary intension of water, in our world, is H2O, which is H2O in every world, because unlike watery stuff it is impossible for H2O to be other than H2O. When considered according to its secondary intention, water is H2O, is true in every world. If two-dimensionalism is workable, it solves some very important problems in the philosophy of language. Saul Kripke has argued that water is H2O is an example of the necessary a posteriori, since we had to discover that water was H2O. But given that it is true, it cannot be false. It would be absurd to claim that something that is water is not H2O, for these are known to be identical.